right now. Now I'll introduce our speakers. Our first speaker, Dr. Dorothy Kim, teaches medieval literature at Brandeis University. Her research focuses on race, gender, digital humanities, medieval women's literary cultures, medievalism, Jewish-Christian difference, book history, digital media, and the alt-right. Our second speaker, Dr. Donna Zuckerberg, is the author of Not All Dead White Men, Classics in Misogyny in the Digital Age. She received her PhD from Princeton University in 2014 and is the founder and editor-in-chief of Eidolon, a prize-winning online publication for informal classic scholarship with more than 1.5 million views. And last, but certainly not least, Dr. Elizabeth Yates is a senior researcher on the domestic radicalization team at START. She works primarily on the suite of datasets associated with PIRUS, our Profiles of Individual Radicalization in the United States dataset, and BIAS, the Bias, Incidence, and Actors Study, with a special focus on far-right extremism, far-right violence, extremism, and hate crimes. So Dorothy, you can go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. I'm gonna share my screen, so let's see how this goes. Oops. There we go. Okay. So is everyone?
We're looking at your desktop right now.
And you can see my screen with the slide, or is it not?
I can see your desktop with a beautiful island on it. It's very pretty.
Let's see why this is very unhappy. Hold on, I might have to stop the share and try again.
No problem. While Dorothy's doing that, I'm going to go ahead and drop a link in the chat. Is Dorothy's Twitter handle. And yes, that looks perfect.
Okay, great. Thanks again for inviting me to this, this panel. So my talk is Digital White Supremacy, White Rage, and the Middle Ages. In July 2018, Milo Yiannopoulos attempted to reboot his tattered media empire by writing a 13,000-word hit piece on me entitled Medieval Rages, Why the Battle for Medieval Studies Matters to America on his digital platform Dangerous. In this piece, Yiannopoulos had included secretly taped material from a talk I gave at the Leeds International Medieval Congress in July 2018. Apparently, this piece was going to get him the paid subscribers necessary to make money on his new media platform. My question is, why did Yiannopoulos imagine that medieval studies or the Middle Ages would return him back to the mainstream alt-right fold? And why didn't it work? I would say that his instinct in going for a medieval topic to return to the alt-right mainstream was correct, since we continue to see white terrorists weaponize the medieval past for the purposes of white terrorism and propaganda, as we have seen at more recently with Christchurch. However, the reasons why it didn't work have everything to do with the form and what seems to be a complete disregard for what Yiannopoulos had done in the past, namely weaponize the digital algorithm and ecosystem for accessible virality. Yiannopoulos' choice to write a meandering, difficult to parse 13,000-word version of a badly written dissertation chapter meant that he did not traffic in his usual algorithmic preferences of short, memeable, accessible, ironic style and form that would have gotten his reboot the attention and subscribers he wanted. Thus, it was not the topic itself that was the problem, but rather the form. But Yiannopoulos' strategy to use the Middle Ages as the groundwork for a media reboot shows that the medieval past is central to the far right ecosystem. The medieval past has become part of this visual and verbal rhetoric in mainstreaming white nationalist, neo-Nazi, and white supremacist propaganda. The digital sociologist Jesse Daniels has written that the white supremacist, white nationalist KKK, and what we now know as the alt-right and extreme right have been early adopters of the internet from the beginning. Daniels wrote in 2009, quote, white supremacists have customized internet technologies in ways that are innovative, sophisticated, and cunning, and the internet is an increasingly important front in the political struggle to contest the meaning of race, racism, and civil rights, unquote. She explains in her 2018 article, The Algorithmic Rise of the Alt-Right, what she had seen in her several decades of following these white supremacist hate groups through multiple media platforms. Quote, there are two strands of conventional wisdom unfolding in popular accounts of the rise of the alt-right. One says that what's really happening can be attributed to a crisis in white identity. The alt-right is simply a manifestation of the angry white male who has status anxiety about his declining social power. Others contend that the alt-right is an unfortunate eddy in the vast ocean of internet culture. Related to this is the idea that polarization, exacerbated by filter bubbles, has facilitated the spread of internet memes and fake news promulgated by the alt-right. While the first explanation tends to ignore the influence of the internet, the second dismisses the importance of white nationalism. I contend that we have to understand both at the same time, unquote. To map the alt-medieval ecosystems is to map their digital nodes, preferred forms, and discussion spaces on multiple platforms. The Middle Ages has been regularly used in white supremacist, KKK, and alt-right rhetoric for centuries. What has accelerated this alt-right ecosystem to become the center of political and social mainstream discourse is whitelash. As Daniels explains, quote, whitelash is algorithmically amplified, sped up, and circulated through networks to other white ethno-nationalist movements around the world, ignored all the while by a tech industry that doesn't see race in the tools it creates, unquote. I would actually like to take it further and say that this is a digital white rage. In reference to Carol Anderson's book, White Rage. Her book examines a litany of historical examples from the 19th century to contemporary American history to argue that any Black advancement and equity since the Civil War, voting rights, Brown versus Board of Education, civil rights, etc., has been met with white rage that has often destroyed the institutions, cities, communities, schools, laws, and country in order to stop racial and especially Black equity and advancement. Daniels has pointed out that what has happened in the last several years is an acceleration of this white rage because of social media. So to understand how the medieval past has become not just an ongoing tool of white supremacist promulgation for several centuries, but a more recent and effective cudgel of the alt-right to use their white supremacist rhetoric, and violent messaging. You have to understand how the alt-medieval is both an ongoing and embedded touchstone for historical groups like the KKK, as well as how digital culture has created unfettered arenas in which the medieval past can be weaponized exponentially through memes, video games, tweets, videos, and Instagram posts to signal a utopic white ethnostate of the future through a white heritage politics of the past. This is a quickly moving and complex ecosystem that is often also funded with dark money. The alt-right's denizens have used this money and are skillful practitioners of digital media platforms to organize and move their message virally. The alt-medieval is then firmly situated in the train of a vast digital ecosystem. The lens of analysis requires both an understanding of the alt-right and its medieval interests, as well as how a digital ecosystem generates, spreads, blankets its white supremacist message widely. So my talk's next section will outline the major nodes of the alt-medieval ecosystem. As Joseph Bernstein's article in BuzzFeed from October 2017 made clear, with evidence from a trove of leaked emails and documents, all parts of the alt-right universe are connected and deliberately take orders from Steve Bannon to infiltrate, normalize, and make racist hate mainstream. Almost all the major nodes of this universe are attached to specific iterations of the medieval past, and almost all the nodes systematically engage their followers in digital spaces. The alt-right is a loose ecosystem of different nodal clusters, along with the use of medieval images, narratives, artifacts for white supremacist propaganda, numerous spaces that are seen as medieval spaces in academia and popular culture and digital spaces have been infiltrated or have attracted numerous members of the alt-right. Even the center of this far-right universe, Steve Bannon, has ideological investments in the Middle Ages. He's interested in Julius Evolar's work, who regularly wrote pieces about chivalry, mysticism, and the Holy Grail. Bannon is creating the curriculum for an alt-right Catholic academy run out of a mountaintop monastery in Italy. So even at the center of the alt-right, the imagined medieval past is central to white supremacy's rhetorical, political, and religio-cultural messaging. The first group I would like to discuss are the Odinists. So this is part of the kind of universe. They often identify as the wolves or sons of Finland and are androphilic anarcho-fascists. They practice a form of toxic masculinity based on their ideas of how the barbaric warriors of medieval Northern Europe functioned as a violent warrior comitatus. Their religion is their version of a pagan medieval Scandinavian religion. Matthew Lyons describes them in his PRA report as a sect that performs, quote, group rituals, including animal sacrifice, and hold fights between members to test their masculinity, unquote. The Wolves of Vinland have also been praised by white nationalist groups like Countercurrents Publishing, and one of their members has been imprisoned for attempting to burn down a Black church in Virginia. More recently, in May 2017, Jeremy Christian's racist hate violence on a MAX train in Portland towards two teenage girls, one who was wearing hijab, became an aggravated violent hate crime in which he murdered two men, Rick Best and Taliesin Murda Namke Meche, and severely injured a third, Micah Fletcher. Oregon Live has covered extensively Christian-specific interest in white supremacist ideology and alt-right propaganda. Christian was filmed as a white supremacist at a white supremacist rally in April of 2017 in Portland, yelling, quote, "Free speech or die, this is my land, Vinland, and RIP city," unquote. Shane Burley and Oregon Live journalists have done an excellent job um, explaining Christian's interest in connecting himself to the musical genre of Viking metal, the Wolves of Finland, and the Oregon alt-right and MRA men's rights activist figure Jack Donovan. Jack Donovan is a main figure in the MRA node of the alt-right, and in May 2017 purchased a parcel of land in the Pacific Northwest. He explains that this land is Waldgang, and it will serve as a spiritual and cultural home in the Cascadia bioregion for the tribe I belong to, the Wolves of Finland, unquote. But the Odinists also appear at other alt-right hate meetings and groups. This includes meetings at the National Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. And Brian Powell wrote about attending a meeting of the Richard Spencer-led NPI in 2011. He explained that several of those attending this meeting described themselves as neo-pagans, the Ausatru folk assembly, and followed the Old Norse religion Ausatru. They would discuss Thor's hammer and runes. The 2017 report from Hope Not Hate highlights how using the neo-pagan medieval Norse religion allows the alt-right not just to recruit white supremacists, but also to form social, religious, and political bonds. This form of religious medievalism is firmly based on a historically inaccurate and white version of the medieval Scandinavian past. In their alt-right report, a report in which a young Swedish male activist went undercover and infiltrated the alt-right, both in Europe and in America for a year, he explained that in London, there are tiny groups, quote, "are tiny Odinist groups, often with a healthy smattering of Nazi adherents. One sunny afternoon, a group of us gathered in the Barbican Center, an iconic brutalist housing complex replete with green areas, for a moot. Stedman, in his typical khaki shorts, lifted a horn to the sky and began to pray to the Nordic gods before taking a gulp of mead. Then he placed a Viking horn to his lips and blew. But instead of bellowing, blast echoing out of a stuttered honk spluttered from his lips," unquote. So this is Stedman, the organizer of the London Forum, a white supremacist hate group. We see the images and symbols of the Odinists, symbols of Vinland, and Sons of Vinland at Charlottesville, and the images of Old Norse runes, Celtic crosses, and the Black Sun, the Sonnenrad. The next medieval religious frame weaponized by the alt-right in the medieval Catholic is the medieval Catholic Crusader. The Crusades were employed in a set of means during the 2016 election, the US elections, as well as during Brexit, in which Deus Vult had become a rallying cry. The distorted return of the Crusades and the Christian Crusader in imagining the West as the defender of democratic Christian values was redeployed after 9/11 by George W. Bush and his administration's war on terror. For a host of different alt-right groups, it specifically evokes an idea of a militaristic and racially motivated defense of the Christian West against a racist fantasy of Islam and Muslims. On January 29, 2017, Alexander Bissonnette, a French-Canadian university student, and white terrorists shot and killed 6 Muslim men in a Quebec City mosque. The Prime Minister of Canada called him a terrorist. He was known to be a supporter of the far right in Canada. In addition, he was a follower of the Trump campaign, and particularly the medieval imagery propagated by the supporters in his campaign. Bissonnette included images of Deus Vult, Crusader Christian imagery as part of his Facebook feed. And as someone who knew him reported, he became enthralled by a borderline racist national movement. Bissonnette took his anger to the enemy, trolling members of a refugee support page with rants against feminazis. The page moderators described the Quebec City terrorists as part of a national conservative identity movement. Bissonnette's flavor of racism was the anti-immigrant, meme-baiting, white nationalist trolling of the extreme elements of the pro-Trump internet. Jason Kessler was the main organizer of Unite the Right at Charlottesville. After August 2017, he decided to reframe his new alt-right group as the New Byzantium. Kessler has imagined a New Byzantium, quote, "a premier organization for pro-white advocacy in the 21st century. In all the instances of the medieval intertwined with the alt-right, the main focus is on the promulgation of white ethno-nationalism, especially in relationship to violent attacks on racialized and religious minorities." As Roland Betancourt explains, quote, "the premise being that when Rome fell, Byzantium preserved the true white European civilization, and that this new Byzantium will preserve white dominance after the fall of the American Empire," unquote. However, the use of Byzantium is not just connected to Kessler and his followers. Betancourt points out that Richard Spencer's wife, or I would say now ex-wife, possibly, Nina Koprianova, who uses Nina Byzantina as her Twitter handle, and appears to indicate that her, quote, radicalized Orthodox Christianity is an inheritance of Byzantium and her Muscovite birthplace as a third Rome following the fall of Constantinople, unquote. This particular node of the alt-right particularly likes to promulgate memes about making Istanbul Constantinople and reclaiming Hagia Sophia. The connection between billionaire money, toxic masculinity, and white supremacy in academia is not a new one. We only need to look at the example of the Occidental Quarterly. At Cal State University Long Beach, now retired psychology professor Kevin McDonald's white nationalist profile is assiduously documented in the SPLC. He is an anti-Semitic Holocaust denier who has published with the official sounding Journal of Historical Review, quote, a well-known Holocaust journal published by the Institute for Historical Review in California, unquote. He's also involved with the Charles Martel Society. Charles Martel is an 8th century Frankish king, son of Pippin, who was involved in the Battle of Tours. The society is not a medieval topic society, but rather a society run by William Regnery II, who bankrolled the society with his inherited wealth and runs things like the Occidental Quarterly, the National Policy Institute, the NPI, the think tank that hired Richard Spencer. The Occidental Quarterly has been called a pseudo-scientific, pseudo-academic journal, and its stated aim is to defend the cultural, ethnic, and racial interests of Western European peoples and examine contemporary political, social, demographic trends that impact the posterity of Western civilization. And it is edited by Kevin McDonald, who himself calls it the Journal for White Identity, White Interest, and the Culture of the West. So if there is a moment in the recent history of medieval studies and current politics that has been sort of ground zero and galvanizing a more sustained and far-reaching discussion of the alt-medieval as well as the complicity of medieval studies in the vision of the Middle Ages as a white supremacist utopia, it has to be the events of August 2017 in Charlottesville. This is the location of the planned Unite the Right rally, the moment as well in which the various nodes of the alt-right changed their communication and discussion tactics and went from very public discussion on open sites like Twitter to semi-private organizing discussions done in private Facebook groups and Discord. However, this itself has become a moving target as various platforms continue to shut down servers like Stormfront or attempt to ban the alt-right on their platforms, including Discord's attempts. Of course, now we're dealing with what the fallout will be of Parler will be into 2020. In a Twitter thread by journalist Emily Gorchensky, who reported directly from Charlottesville during the night and day of the Unite the Right deadly terrorist attacks on August 2017, she ironically points out, after recent convictions, arrests, and terrorist assault charges, quote, strange how all these violent neo-Nazis kept hanging out with each other in the same spaces where they planned violence and then did violence and then went to prison, and this almost seemed connected and not a sequence of independent random events, unquote. This idea that certain elements of the alt-right, their organizing tactics, their use of certain textual, visual, and other rhetoric, their cultural interests, etc., are somehow haphazard and not deliberately planned, organized, deployed for specific effects and returns is a heady form of imagined presumed innocence that imagines individuality, agency, and the benefits of the doubt to white bodies in direct contrast to the presumption of guilt, suspicion, and criminality to Black bodies. It also upholds the idea of a lone wolf myths that need to be firmly put to bed in relationship to the alt-right, far-right. Even as academic, medievalists, and the public have absorbed the impact of Charlottesville on our academic and public spaces, there have been a consistent puzzlement about why the alt-right would use various bits of the medieval past in their ideological machine to mainstream alt-right white supremacy. The use of these images, text, symbols, etc., have been discussed in various pieces as a surprise and also seen as a choice of individual members who may have an amateur interest in the medieval past, the classics, etc., whose demographic may overlap with that of medieval video game aficionados, LARP participants, consumers of the show Game of Thrones and the Vikings, as well as other popular cultural medievalism productions. However, as more information and documentation from these alt-right nodes have become available publicly or to journalists, it's crystal clear that weaponizing the medieval past is a concerted, deliberate tactic. We know for a fact that the long array of white supremacy and white supremacists have included a medieval element, i.e. the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, was entirely about were entirely about utilizing the Middle Ages to uphold Anglo-Saxon supremacy in the United States. In fact, a clear demonstration of the deliberate weaponized use of the medieval past can be seen in the digital organizing for Charlottesville. So in April 2018, Unicorn Riots released massive files of the leaked Discord chats among several groups who organized and participated in the Charlottesville terrorist event in August 2017. Unicorn Riot had also organized these chats into a searchable database. So if you look up the word medieval, there are 53 entries that include a discussion of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the Society for Creative Anachronism, Renaissance Fair, it's a New York medieval fair, which one of them attended as a completely decked out serf, medieval literature classes, medieval music, medieval video games, and medieval weaponry and shields. In this latter category, we see a discussion of Charlottesville as one member, Goldstein Riots on Discord, asked, are we going to get medieval in Charlottesville? All you Maryland guys know jesting is our state sport, right? If you put in the term shield, you will hit 1,058 messages and an entire discussion of what kind of shields to bring to Charlottesville. On June 6, 2017, ADD messages on the Charlottesville 2.0 message board, quote, we should bring circle shields with a crescent cut out of each side, like the Romans. We can stick them together and become an undefeatable wall, protected battle unit, unquote. Matthew Heimbach points out on the Charlottesville 2.0 demonstration tactics board that, quote, TWP has shields, TWP being the traditional workers' party that he runs. Kurt Lipper on June 17th responds on the Charlottesville 2.0 gear and attire thread. I like the aesthetics of shields. In general, optics saying that we are about defense. All of this is in our own defense until we were pushed too far. Charlemagne, Maryland on June 17 wants to know in the Charlottesville 2.0 demonstration tactics thread where Heimbach made the TWP shields out of, since Vanguard made theirs from Baltic birch. Bainbjorn on June 6, 2017 in the Charlottesville gear and attire thread that the plan is clear. Quote, this is very simple. We figure out how many of their platforms, how many people we estimate to attend, then designate 5 to 10% as security force. If we do shields, they need to be all the same. Optics are very important, and the Nordic resistance is doing this the right way. If everyone shows up with their own versions of things, we look disorganized and like common rabble. If everyone wears a white shirt and khakis and our security has the exact same shield and helmets, then we look legitimate. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have to have uniformity in everything we do if we are serious. No rogues, no lone wolves, no individuals. So the medieval and visual and textual rhetoric are not accidents, but deliberate, organized, planned, and weaponized as part of the far right profile. Different groups may use different parts of the medieval past because of the ideological histories and investments in certain medieval touchstones. However, it runs as a thread through almost all of the far right noodle ecosystem. So this is the last bit, Christchurch and the alt-medieval in 2019. So the last part of this talk will discuss Christchurch and how a digital medieval analysis actually is an example of a larger pattern from this white terrorist massacre. The white terrorists who murdered 51 Muslim men, women, and children in at Al Noor Mosque and the Linwood Muslim Center in Christchurch in March 2019, released what Joan Donovan described as a press kit rather than a manifesto. The white terrorists had organized a media plan that included Facebook Live videos, cut and paste manifestos, and several digital platforms and images on Twitter. His multi-platform media strategy literally left the usual alt-right ecosystem fairly quiet in the immediate wake of the attack, in stark contrast to every other white terrorist shooting. As two BuzzFeed reporters explain, quote, what we see is a killer who created the equivalent of a multi-platform content strategy to maximize his reach, push his message, and force the media and social media platforms to navigate a minefield of coded messages aimed at helping to push his agenda even after he was captured or killed, unquote. In addition, Joan Donovan explains the digital news mainstreaming cycle, quote, in the aftermath of outbursts of violence, such as the one in New Zealand, traditional news outlets draw heavily on social media postings for insight into the perpetrator's motives and mines them for details that make stories sound more authoritative and vivid. Certain oddball phrases, internet memes, and obscuring message boards garner mainstream attention for the first time. Inevitably, people Google them. The extra attention that these ideas gain in the aftermath of a violent attack isn't just an unfortunate side effect of news coverage. It is a sound system by which extremist movements transmit their ideas to a broader public, and they are using it with more and more skill, unquote. Thus, the media kit is a specific and deliberate tactic to gain attention and mainstream a white supremacist agenda. Medievalists who began to write and be interviewed for pieces in mainstream media did not seem to realize the point of this tactic. As this white terrorist cut and paste every possible reference, alt-right ideology, and figure that he thought might further get his attention, he did the same with the medieval references. Black Sun, Valhalla, the Ethel rune, Charles Martel, Aker, Diaz, Bull, Bisenig, Knights Templar, etc. If the alt-right previously had very specific reasons to use certain medieval events, people, ideas, terms, images that upheld specific ideological narratives and histories, then what happened with the spread of the medieval indicates a major shift. If this is an indication of the current terrain of the alt-medieval and what it may look like in the future beyond this being a version of medieval shitposting. Shitposting is when someone posts nonsensical or ironic, derailing material to get an outsized reaction. The weaponization of the medieval past is generalized, and now all the Middle Ages is up for grabs as a pressure point to attract alt-right attention. In other words, invoking the medieval past has now become a more generalized sign of the alt-right, and the rapidity of the digital multi-platform approach has begun to obscure the reasons for certain medieval things being attached to certain parts of the alt-right ecosystem. In the current speed and acceleration of the digital ecosystem, and with continued multi-platform plans, sophisticated media strategies, the point is not the specifics of the historical detail or what certain medieval things may mean to certain subgroups. Instead, the point is to gather them all for the maximum amount of attention and also to plant as many flags to say, quote, I am a white supremacist, unquote, and to activate his other white supremacist terrorists globally. He accomplished this, as we saw in the string of copycat attacks in Poway, California on a synagogue in April 2019, the El Paso massacre in August 2019, and in the failed terrorist attack in Norway at a mosque in August 2019. So I wrote and analyzed the New Zealand white terrorism attack for my book, Digital Whiteness and Medieval Studies, which is forthcoming with the University of Minnesota Press in 2021, and was the last terrorist incident I analyzed before sending it off for peer reviewers in April 2019. So I'm like running out of time. So several days ago, the New Zealand government published an almost 800-page report about the Christchurch white terrorist massacre. I actually read in the last 48 hours all 800 pages with a lot of chocolate. I wanted to just say something really quickly about this. And the kind of amplification, there's definitely very interesting things to think about in terms of YouTube, but the amplification of a false trail, and if you follow that trail in relationship to the medieval. And so I'm just gonna end it here. If you read this, what is on the screen, he like lays out this very elaborate sort of fake rabbit hole for various agencies to follow that goes nowhere, but really sort of, using the Knights Templar as a way to sort of signal, oh, this must be a white terrorist. And if you go down this hole, then you'll like find a network of all these things. So I'm going to end it there, but I'm happy to talk about the New Zealand report since I have many, many thoughts about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. That's fantastic. If you could stop sharing your screen for me, and I'll turn it over to Donna.
Do that. There you go.
Thank you. Donna, you can go ahead and share your screen. You can get started. And while Donna is setting that up, I'm just dropping in the chat her Twitter handle in case you want to go ahead and join her on Twitter. You're welcome to do that. Donna, you're muted right now.
Okay, great. I don't need to share my screen. I can.
Okay.
I'm using this weird tool, so.
Sure. If anyone has any trouble viewing it, you're welcome to expand your screen, and then you'll be able to see it a bit better. But Donna, you can go ahead.
All right, great, perfect, thank you. And thank you to Erin for inviting me, and to Dorothy for that, Dr. Kim for that talk. I've admired your work for such a long time, so it was really a treat to get to hear the sneak preview of your book. And I'm looking forward to picking your brain a little bit more about that 800-page report in the Q&A. And chocolate is crucial. I first became aware of the online far right's fascination with classics about 5 years ago now, in late August 2015, before the alt-right was a significant cultural presence. It was about 4 months after the launch of Eidolon, the online classics publication that I run, and we've been enjoying some modest success. But in late August, we had our first big hit with an article titled, "Why is Stoicism Having a Cultural Moment?" by Chiara Saprizio. I was curious about where the traffic for the article was coming from, so I took a look at Medium's analytics tool, and I found that a small but significant portion of the traffic was coming from the social news site Reddit. I followed this traffic with some trepidation. While Reddit is now a much better regulated site, and Dr. Kim was talking about how various platforms have been working to clean up in the past few years, in August 2015, Reddit was a cesspool. There's really no other word for it. So it was with relief that I found that the Reddit traffic to our article was coming from a Stoicism subreddit, which was a benign, actually quite nice place, on which at the time about 30,000 subscribers were discussing how to apply Stoic principles to their lives. And since 2015, the number of subscribers has gone from around 30,000 to 335,000. So as it turns out, Stoicism really is having a cultural moment. One of the users had posted our article, and the others were discussing whether Stoicism was really experiencing a surprising moment or whether it was merely recovering from a cultural slump, and it has generally throughout time been a very popular philosophy. But what caught my eye was this comment that I've shared here, attributing Stoicism's resurgent popularity to the red pill. And in case you can't see, the commenter wrote, "I'd like to point out how I came across Stoicism, as I think it has at least played a small role in the large influx of those who have recently been drawn to Stoicism. If you haven't heard of the red pill or married red pill, I will provide a quick description. They are two subs dedicated to capital M men who want to live a capital M masculine life and learn how the female mind works in order to improve their sexual strategies. These subs both promote Stoicism as the go-to philosophy from which men should live their life." This comment had -5 points, which means that the other subscribers to the Stoicism subreddit didn't like it. And it turns out that there's actually a little bit of a turf war within the Stoicism subreddit, where most of the people in the Stoicism subreddit don't like the red pill Stoics, and sometimes call them broics, which I think is kind of funny. But, and also this poster has since deleted his account, which again is not a great sign of integration into the overall Reddit ecosystem. But his assertion that the red pill community was interested in Stoicism seemed to me to deserve further investigation. And I'm going to share the same image that Dorothy did. On its face, the connection between the red pill and Stoicism is a rather inapposite pairing. The surviving Stoic texts primarily dispense advice on how to respond rationally to difficult situations, ideally without getting needlessly upset. While the red pill, as I already knew, was a community where angry men fan the flames of each other's rage and encourage each other to invade feminist spaces and verbally attack women. When I began looking into this somewhat unexpected instance of classical reception, my working hypothesis was that the red pill community was blurring the distinction between Stoicism, the ancient philosophy, what you might call capital S Stoicism, and lowercase s Stoicism, the general idea of having control over displaying your emotions, or even control over the emotions themselves. And by taking advantage of the potential for slippage between those two terms, they could make a trait that is typically coded masculine in our society appear more intellectually sophisticated and philosophically sound. And to a certain extent, that is what I found, but it isn't all that I found. Before I give any further explanation of the extent of red pill classical reception, and also what I think it means, I want to give some more background on what the red pill is. At its core, the red pill comprises hundreds of thousands of people, almost exclusively men, more than 3/4 of whom, according to self-reported surveys taken within the community, are white, heterosexual, politically conservative, have no strong religious affiliation, and are between the ages of 18 and 35. They are united by the idea that white, heterosexual, cisgender men are discriminated against in our society. They know that this is the opposite of how many people view reality, and they believe that they have attained a form of enlightenment that allows them to see through the Orwellian doublethink of American society. Many of them describe a sort of conversion process of discovering how unfair the world truly is to men, and specifically to white men. And this conversion process ends with an epiphanic moment known as swallowing the red pill. The terminology is taken from the famous scene in the 1989 film The Matrix, in which Lawrence Fishburne's Morpheus offers Keanu Reeves' Neo a choice between blissful ignorance and learning the truth about their reality. Morpheus offers Neo a red pill and a blue pill, and he tells him, if you take the blue pill, the story ends, you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth. The predominantly white heterosexual men of the red pill believe that the truth is that they need to maintain solidarity with each other because the idea of white male supremacy is an illusion maintained to ensure that they remain oppressed. Dr. Kim described the evolution of the alt-right primarily from the digital white nationalism movement, so I'm going to pay a little more attention here to the other main thread, its evolution out of digital misogyny and toxic masculinity. Men's rights activists were the dominant force in the red pill community in its earliest days back in the late aughts, when the internet was still young. Back then, the red pill's primary goal was the elimination of laws and social norms that they saw as fundamentally oppressive to men, including divorce, child support, and custody laws, and the extension of default credibility to women who claim to have been sexually assaulted. Because dismantling oppressive social norms is also a feminist concern, and because these men tend to use slightly less inflammatory rhetoric than other red pill subgroups, they remain the most mainstream segment of the community. Over time, however, the red pill has grown and has moved away from addressing those concerns and begun to argue forcefully for a very reactionary model of gender politics. This shift began when the red pill umbrella grew to include the pickup artist or game community, whose beliefs the post on the Stoicism subreddit succinctly described. These are men who want to understand female psychology and then use it to their advantage in sexual relationships. Other groups included in the red pill include the men going their own way, who believe that the so-called sexual marketplace is so skewed in favor of women that the only rational choice is to opt out entirely and engage in marriage strikes. And also the incels, short for involuntary celibates, who believe that they are the ultimate losers of the sexual marketplace, so unattractive that they will never be able to convince women to sleep with them. The red pill community also includes more or less the members of Gamergate, the 2014 online movement of gamers opposed to what they perceived as the rise of feminism and political correctness in their community. More recently, in 2016, the red pill expanded to include the alt-right, a vocally white supremacist and anti-Semitic community that uses memes and a kind of subversive irreverence to normalize neo-Nazi ideology, as well as the alt-right's less obviously offensive cousin, the alt-light, which shies away from outright white supremacy, but instead has positioned itself as the defenders of Western civilization. Crucially, many of the most prominent individuals in the red pill have occupied several of these categories at several different points in time. The same individuals are responsible for promoting misogyny and white supremacy, and misogyny in the form of control of white female fertility is crucial to their white supremacist views. In late 2015, I pursued that fascination with Stoicism and the red pill and started to research and write a book about classical reception in far-right online spaces. On November 2, 2016, I turned in a manuscript draft, and its underlying thesis was something like, I know that these alt-right guys are a distant bad memory now that Hillary Clinton is our president, but this was an important moment in contemporary classical reception that we need to understand better, and this book will help you do that. So before the manuscript had even reached the inboxes of my peer reviewers, I realized that it would have to be substantially rewritten. Exactly 10 days after Donald Trump was elected, I gave a lecture at UC Santa Barbara about my research, and I left the Q&A with an overwhelming feeling that many people had been profoundly shaken in their sense of what it meant to be a classicist. So over the course of 2.5 days after that, my fellow editors and I wrote, rewrote, commissioned art, debated titles, and then published what is still Eidolon's most read article, How to Be a Good Classicist Under a Bad Emperor, which is a reference to Tacitus. The article was part of my rethinking and rewriting process as I tried to figure out what my research project meant in this new and terrifying world. How to Be a Good Classicist was intended primarily as a warning to my US colleagues about the kind of fascist-inflected uses of ancient Greece and Rome that I expected to see more and more of in online communities that were empowered and energized by the election of Donald Trump. It was also meant as a spur to action to convince the field that we needed to start thinking very seriously and carefully about how we wanted to respond to this kind of appropriation. I wrote, obviously the ideological battle over classics pales in comparison to the many, many more important battles we will spend the next few years fighting over immigration, healthcare, the environment, reproductive rights. We need to do what we can in those battles as well. Give some of your time and your money, use your expertise as a writer and a teacher, resist however you can. But classicists are uniquely positioned to fight back against the self-mythologizing of the alt-right. When we see classics used to support a hateful politics, we must push back unless we want to live through a second wave of fascist classical reception. What I discovered in my research is that the red pill takes a two-pronged approach to defending the classics. First, they push back forcefully against what they consider the wrong, which is to say progressive kind of classics wherever they find it. And there's a great deal of it for them to find. Progressive classics is, I'm happy to say, flourishing online. Recent years have seen the growth of a number of substantial projects focused on social justice with a predominantly digital presence. From the Sportial Collective to the Classics and Social Justice Group to the Women of Ancient History Project to the Asian American Classical Caucus. Progressive classics has been thriving, especially on Twitter, in the social media presences of both established senior faculty like Emily Wilson and also in wonderful live tweeting threads done by graduate students. Classics Twitter has given a voice to a new generation of classicists who are articulating in exciting ways what they think the discipline should look like in the future. Phenomenal as this efflorescence is, it has also led to an inevitable backlash, which tends to take a predictable form. So this is very recent, just a few months ago. An artist tweeted drawings she'd done of famous Roman poets with dark skin tones, for which there is ample evidence of a wide variety of skin tones in ancient Rome. She was immediately mobbed by Twitter trolls, some of whom accused her of blackwashing history, others of whom responded in horrible and overtly racist ways, like this particular tweeter who wrote why they look like they're about to burn down and loot a city because some drug dealer got shot by the cops. The tweeters of these vile racist comments seemed totally uninterested in actually learning from the many classicists who joined the threads with evidence and documentation that ancient Romans had a wide variety of skin tones. It is as unsurprising and as unfortunate that actual knowledge about classical antiquity matters less to the far right than the vague concept of heritage. While some within the red pill focus on fighting back against the wrong kind of classics, others work to articulate their own vision of what they want ancient Greece and Rome to mean in the present day. In my book, I explored a few different case studies, and one of the chapters is about the far right interest in Stoicism, the topic that first led me down this path. Stoicism may not seem like an obvious choice as a philosophy for the alt-right. One has only to think of the instantly iconic image from the rally in Charlottesville of young white men holding tiki torches with their faces contorted with rage. Online, however, many influential red pill writers profess to be devotees of Stoicism. Today, the adjective stoic is most commonly used to describe people who don't show the world what they're feeling, but instead keep their emotions under tight control and push them down. Ancient Stoics, on the other hand, were less interested in the display of emotions than in understanding what caused them. The Stoics aspired to live rationally and accept that they only had control over their own behavior. Stoic ethics in general is formulated around the idea that the only true good is virtue. According to Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, health and wealth, for example, are not inherently good. They're just preferable to their opposites. So actions that are aimed toward obtaining health and wealth are appropriate if they don't conflict with virtue. Anything that doesn't either tend toward or obstruct virtue is indifferent. Emotions are usually the result of irrationally believing that somebody else's actions have hurt or benefited you. So the true Stoic would not hide grief when a loved one died. He would accept the fundamental irrationality of that grief, since all humans are mortal and the death of another human has no direct impact on your ability to be virtuous. The Stoic thinker Epictetus wrote in his discourses that the appropriate response to the death even of your child is to say to yourself, I knew I had fathered a mortal. Anger was particularly anathema to the Stoics, one of the most dangerous irrational impulses. The Roman philosopher and statesman Seneca the Younger wrote an entire treatise about anger's destructive force. The appropriation of Stoicism works as a legitimizing strategy on several levels for the red pill. Appeals to Stoicism are part of the larger project of asserting the value of the cultural artifacts of Western civilization. But more subtly, by claiming an affiliation with Stoic self-control, these men assert their inherent moral superiority to women and people of color who are often stereotyped as irrational and emotional and even childlike. On one blog, Meditations is praised for, and I quote, teaching a man how to be a man through gaining control of his emotions and reactions to the world and transforming them into action. Across the red pill, Stoicism is tacitly assumed to be an inherently masculine philosophy. Only a man can gain control of his emotions. And there's nobody more frustrating to try to argue with online than an angry troll who has convinced himself that he is perfectly rational and calm, and you are the one who is unhinged. I also devote a chapter in my book to the reception of Ovid's Ars Amatoria within the pickup artist community, which is a fascinating, complex topic that I can only touch on briefly today. The short version is that a few prominent members of the game community see the Ars Amatoria as the first ever pickup artist manual. This connection helps reinforce their argument that gender is not a social construct, but that men and women have fixed, immutable natures that do not change through the millennia. It therefore does not matter that the concepts underlying how we think about sex and sexual relationships today, our ideas about sexuality, gender, race, and class, have shifted considerably from the conceptual categories that existed in first century CE Rome. This is a central tenet of red pill philosophy more generally. Members of the red pill believe that their interpretation of masculinity is revolutionary and subversive, but with strong historical roots as well as a basis in what they perceive as biological fact. Even more concerningly, the authorial voice within the Ars Amatoria often gives his reader advice that borders on sexual assault. And sometimes I would say goes over the border and just is obviously sexual assault. He tells the reader that women may pretend to be unwilling to preserve the appearance of chastity, but that their reluctance is actually all an act. Although most classicists argue that the Ars Amatoria is a complex poetic game, pickup artists take the text at face value and use it to justify their belief that male desire is more important than female boundaries, and that what women want, think, and consent to is immaterial. If I'd written my book now instead of several years ago, I would have had an entire chapter about Sparta and right-wing militias, a topic that I didn't really even end up touching on that much in the book because I was sort of putting the finishing touches on it around the time of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. And this feels to me from 2020 like the book's most important omission, especially with Donald Trump's recent appeal to the Proud Boys and the thankfully mostly unrealized threat that these militias would interfere with voting. Many of the threats that I addressed in my book are somewhat nebulous. Misogyny and white supremacy have real, measurable negative impacts on society, but they can be somewhat hard to measure, which is why I think the work that you're doing at START is so important. But right-wing militias are right there, waving guns in our faces, murdering people out on the streets. And many of them do take their inspiration from both the medieval period and also from ancient Sparta. Part of the reason why I wrote this book was just because I thought that it should exist so that other people wouldn't have to do the research. It felt like somebody should do it. And I seemed like more or less the right person to do it because it was a strange project, reception in online spaces that might not make sense for somebody on the tenure track, but most people without the job security of tenure, most people who, somebody who was on the tenure track without job security wouldn't want to do it, but somebody who had the job security of tenure would probably be too old to find far-right Reddit communities a worthwhile site of classical reception. I was an independent scholar who unusually had enough privilege that I felt I could handle the harassment and abuse that such a project might bring. But once I published the book, then it would exist for people to cite and point to and say that far-right classical reception absolutely exists and is a problem, and that there's a book out from an established university press that says so. Of course, I also worried that the flip side of that was true, and that by doing an academic study of these trolls, we're giving them a kind of victory, but I try not to think about that too much. I wrote this book so that others wouldn't have to do the, on occasion, somewhat scarring research that I did, and I felt that the job of openly confronting white supremacists who were using classics should be the job of privileged white people. That's the least that privileged white scholars could do. Ultimately, you can never really stop the white supremacists from being drawn to and using classics, but scholars can help provide a toolkit that can make responding to them easier and that will make classics as a discipline more vibrant and diverse. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. That was great. Before I turn it over to Liz, allow me to reassure my attendees, our attendees, that we'll keep going until about 3:30 Eastern, so another half hour or so. So you'll have plenty of time for Q&A. If you have to duck out a bit early, that's okay. We'll have the recording on the website by the end of the day. Liz, you're welcome to share your screen. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Let me just pull this up here.
For everyone, I've dropped our project, our domestic radicalization project Twitter handle in the chat, so you're welcome to go and follow that at your leisure.
Thank you. So first, thank you, Erin and our comms team for organizing this. And thank you, of course, to Dr. Kim and Dr. Zuckerberg for showing up today and talking about this. It's a really important conversation to have if, for those of us who want to understand misogynist and white supremacist terrorism, to talk about some of these bigger dialogues that they're embedded in is really important, even if they're, the terrorists and the individuals involved and the kinds of events that we typically study here at START are a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of these dialogues. They are part of them, and so we want to understand that. So thank you for being here and doing this. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and try to show, use some very basic data analysis to show not only how this rhetoric that of historical appropriation and to some extent mythologizing might be linked to specific actors and events on the far right, but also to some larger trends in terrorism generally. So for those of you who think I've never been to a START event that lasted almost an entire hour without an Excel spreadsheet, or an Excel graph, don't worry, I've got you covered. It's going to be fine. We've got a bunch of them. But today I've titled my presentation Toward Europe, the Transformation of Far-Right Terrorism in the United States. And so what I'm going to show today is that our data shows that the landscape of far-right terrorism in the United States has changed a lot over the last couple of years, especially in the last decade and 5 years, maybe even more, right? And it's changed in ways that actually make it look more like far-right terrorism in the rest of the world and specifically in Western Europe. So by looking at these long-term trends from a couple of different ways, we can see how the transformation of American far-right terrorism draws on these dialogues that are especially sort of Europe focused. So I'm going to go over some basic data trends, and then I'm going to promise to tie it up quickly at the end with a couple of examples of attacks that have advanced or that have been a part of these larger trends and that have clearly drawn on these dialogues in their mobilization. Okay, so one of the major data trends that most people can agree on that we can see in far-right terrorist attacks in the United States recently has been simply the growth in the number of attacks. And actually, I should say here before I go much farther that this data comes from the Global Terrorism Database. Recently, a few of us at START have done some extra coding of attacks looking specifically at some details about the motivations of far-right attacks so that we can analyze motivations and ideologies in a little bit more detail. So it's preliminary, and we're certainly excited to show it off and to get some comments back on it. But I should also say that the Global Terrorism Database is a database of terrorism incidents, and that's only one small dimension of what we are all sort of observing right now as far-right activity or even far-right violence, right? It requires premeditation and some very obvious messaging. And so that doesn't always include some of the really common types of far-right violence, including spontaneous hate crimes, nor nonviolent activities such as, flying with violent messages or vandalism or that kind of thing. It also does include certain types of arson and attacks that might not be included in other types. So that's just to say this is one dimension of this larger phenomena that we are looking at. But clearly what we can see is that these types of attacks have absolutely gone up. You saw, a handful of them, generally fewer than 10 until about 2012, and then a clear escalation in number. So these N, this N is still small, right? We're talking about, fewer than 40 attacks in 2018, 2019. Some of these, of course, are mass casualty attacks killing, dozens of people, and some of them are, less well-known, premeditated hate crimes or attempts and that kind of thing. So that's clearly, one transformation in the landscape of far-right terrorism in the US right now. So what we did then is compare that trend to what we see in what we're sort of generally calling the West, the place where far-right terrorism and the far-right tends to be most similar to far-right extremism and terrorism in the United States, and that's Western Europe, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, right? And so what you can see here is that the trend is similar in that it's sort of, goes up and down, but generally started to jump and go up around 2012, 2013, 2014. But before you all screenshot this and share it with all your friends and everything, please don't do that because actually one part of this is largely wrong. So I cut it off here the number in 2015, 2016, and 2017 at 40 for outside the US, because actually, and I'll show this data in a moment, there was actually a huge escalation in the number of attacks, specifically targeting refugee centers, which we typically categorize as far-right attacks because of the anti-immigrant xenophobic nature of them. So there actually is a huge increase in that number, but I didn't want to entirely erase what you could see here is that the trend is like similarly going up. But since we really do want to show you the actual data, what you can see here is there's a huge spike in, and this is largely due to attacks on immigrant and refugee centers here in 2015, 2016, 2017, especially in Germany, some in Sweden, but just an overwhelming number in Germany. So you can't, if you look at it at this scale, you can't necessarily see the growth in US attacks and outside US attacks in previous years, but as we saw before, it's certainly there, right? The second trend in the transformation of American far-right extremism, or I should say far-right terrorism in the United States, is the growth in xenophobic attacks. So let me show you real quick though. This is the number of attacks in the global terrorism database focused on refugee asylum centers. It doesn't include necessarily all of them, of course, if there was evidence that it wasn't far-right. But as you can see, it's a huge chunk of the attacks in, especially this is really in Europe here. So I just wanted to show you the numbers here. So that, you can see that this is about, I think 2015, it's like 80 some, and the total number was, I think 130 or something like that. So the numbers of attacks were still high, but the overwhelming number came from this specific attack on refugees during that moment in time. But what we can see is in the United States, the growth of xenophobic attacks as a percent of total attacks. So keep in mind, this is while, generally starting about 2012, while the overall number is growing, that the attacks tend to be focused more on immigrant targets, on Muslim targets, rather than on some of the more, I hate to say more common targets in the United States, including African Americans, abortion centers. And I'll show you some of those comparisons in a moment. But one of the things I find most interesting about this transformation is that it does make it look more like far-right extremism in especially Western Europe, right? Where their far-right extremism, the ideologies of it have typically focused on immigrant populations. And so they've been especially focused on xenophobic attacks because that's the population that they've targeted forever. And this is actually more of a new shift in the United States. So while it's not as large, and of course it goes up and down with all of them, you can see after here in after the 9/11 attacks, there was a jump in the percentage of xenophobic attacks that focused, or far-right attacks that focused on xenophobic targets, but it's grown recently. And then in a little more specificity, what I want to point out is actually that this growth in xenophobic attacks is actually especially focused, or especially a product of anti-Muslim attacks. So we came up with a coding that really captured anything that had clear intentions towards Muslims, anyone identified as Arab or Middle Eastern, and refugee attacks, which of course are not all Muslims, but in the in the dialogue that was occurring at that time, it was pretty clear that most of those attacks were really anti-Muslim or anti-Middle Eastern in nature. So you can see here, this blue line is the United States, right? And so after 9/11, not surprisingly, there was a number of anti-Muslim attacks. I think a lot of us are familiar with those. And then there were, a handful, again, this is when the numbers were pretty small, right? So you see a handful in the first decade of the 2000s, and then you see it really start to become a pretty important part, a pretty central part of attacks, less than 50%, but still a pretty high number after 2012. And so it's dipped and ebbed here a little bit, but it's still been a pretty large percent. And I can tell you that I'm using global terrorism database data right now, as I said, but we have another data set, the bias incidence and actor study, and it shows something similar, that looking at hate crimes, particularly violent hate crimes, that anti-Muslim attacks have become a larger share of overall hate crimes during this period. So that has been a central driver. And again, that is something that has long been a central target for European far-right extremists. And so as US far-right extremists have started to adopt Muslims as a more common target, that does make them have more in common with their perceived enemies elsewhere in the world. And then I just want to show you, this is just the US again, to underscore that point that while attack numbers are growing throughout this period, as you can see, a number of them are growing, anti-Muslim attacks are growing even more consistently, right? So you've still got anti-abortion attacks. Those have not disappeared. You've certainly got anti-Semitic attacks. There was a big jump in them in 2019. I think, most advocates for all of these groups would report increases in attacks on their particular communities. And so as these numbers are growing generally, they're all still a very big problem, but anti-Muslim attacks have grown very consistently. And that's just something, it's, the comparison really shows that. And then you can see sort of the same thing here looking at the percentage, right? So you've seen anti-Black, moves up and down, anti-Semitic moves up and down, and anti-Muslim just happens to be pretty high. And again, this is just this is terrorism, so it's not including a lot of hate crimes. And of course, reporting for hate crimes, as we know, is very low. So we don't have great numbers on that, but the trends here are pretty clear. The final trend that I'm going to talk about is the growth in mass casualty attacks. So our definition of mass casualty here is an attempt to kill to injure or kill 4 more people. And that is something that wasn't really a tactic among far-right extremists very frequently prior to the last few years. So of course, we're all familiar with the devastating attacks of Timothy McVeigh and other attempts in the 90s and in the 80s, even in the 2000s. They certainly occurred, but they were like 1 or 2 a year, right? This is just in the US. And then suddenly they've really expanded and we've had much larger numbers. Again, they're still small. This is, 10, 12 a year, but compared to, 1 or 2 over a decade, each year over a decade, this is a pretty big expansion. So the most famous of these, of course, are the successful and very devastating attacks in El Paso, in Pittsburgh, those attacks, but there are also, a number of sort of failed attacks that were successful in getting out the door, but maybe the bomb did not go off and kill enough people, or they were not as successful as they wanted to be. But it doesn't include all sorts of foiled attacks. We've had we've seen a number of arrests from the FBI targeting individuals who were building weapons stocks or had plans to target different individuals and communities. So again, this is only one image of this trend, but it's pretty clearly a difference in tactics that we've seen. And again, this is also happening around the world. Our data again is rendered a little bit, the comparison is rendered a little bit less visible by the large attack on refugee centers in 2015, 2016, 2017, many of which qualify because they were attacks on refugee centers, arson attacks at night when people were sleeping there and that kind of thing. But clearly it's going up around the world too, elsewhere around the world. So I want to conclude by just looking at a couple of the manifestos of these far-right mass casualty attacks in the US to show how these ideas about history, how this appropriation of history influenced these actors and these actors who then perpetrated acts that are really consistent with the larger trends we've seen, right? So these are photos of victims of the Poway synagogue shooting. And then I just want to read you a couple of quotes from the manifesto of that shooter. He started his thing by saying, my name is, and I am a man of European ancestry. The blood that runs through my veins is the same that ran through the English, Nordic, and Irish men of old. And men of old, of course, is a phrase that, he stuck in there. I'm sure it sounded great to him. But in any case, the manifesto itself, he's an American. He targeted a synagogue, I think not too far from his home. He also targeted a mosque earlier, again, somewhere generally in his community. But his manifesto is like almost exclusively focused on his goals for ridding the world of Jewish people. It's very international focused. I think he uses the phrase European. He refers to himself as a European man, and keep in mind he's born and raised in California. I think, he references the European race 13 times, the white race 15 times, and he refers to his nation, meaning the United States, just once or twice in one sentence or something like that. So his entire dialogue is really focused on this idea of the white race as an international, a transnational people. And his defense is at that level. It's not really at the national level, right? And so I think by emphasizing his European ancestry, that's really important to him. And then he also refers to some specific historical incidents, including the murder of a boy named Simon in like the 1500s, that was used to scapegoat Jewish people in that period. And so again, he's sort of drawing on this dialogue that Dr. Kim talked about, that sort of appropriation of this to sort of give themselves an identity and to link them to this larger heritage. And again, I just put this last quote at the bottom. There's at least one European man alive who's willing to take a stand. Again, even though he's this California guy who attacked 2 California communities, he's really focused on himself as a European. And so he also, again, this is a xenophobic attack as it is anti-Semitic, and his other attack was anti-Muslim. It's a mass casualty. It was an attempted mass casualty attack. And of course, it was more recent. So again, this is someone whose attack is very consistent with the larger trends that we've seen and is directly appropriating and integrating himself into these historical online dialogues. Oops. Okay, so the last one I want to talk about here is the shooter in El Paso. His manifesto, in some ways, is very different. He describes himself as, he describes himself as a defender specifically of Texas. It's not only nationally focused, but it's actually very state focused. He starts out by saying, in general, I support the Christchurch shooter in his manifesto. This attack is a response to the Hispanic invasion of Texas. So then he goes on to directly reference political dynamics in the United States, economic dynamics in the United States. He's like very specifically speaking to the contemporary political, socio-economic context in the United States. But he says, you know, this is directly influenced by the Christchurch attack, by the Christchurch shooter. And of course, that manifesto was replete with historical references and was entirely transnational, given that it was perpetrated by a non-national in another country towards Muslims, right? So he's a person who, rather than in the previous example, sort of, framing himself as a part of a international struggle, primarily, he portrays himself primarily as a national defender or even a state defender in a local way, but he certainly associates himself with this larger international European context that draws directly on this historical appropriation mythologizing. And that's obvious not only, of course, in the timing and in the strategy, the fact that it was a mass casualty attack and that it occurred, right after in this series of attacks inspired by the Christchurch shooter. But he also says, actually, the Hispanic community was not my target before I read The Great Replacement, which is the manifesto in the Christchurch shooting. So it's very clear that even while he has this very nationalist, very locally focused manifesto and attack, that the target was actually directly inspired by this transnational attack that was focused on completely different targets, right, on Muslims as opposed to Hispanics or Latinx people. But again, he does link himself to this larger fight, right? So he says, many people think that the fight for America is already lost. They couldn't be more wrong. This is just the beginning of a fight for America in Europe. So again, as we see these trends, increased numbers of attacks, more xenophobic attacks, especially more anti-Muslim attacks and more mass casualty attacks occurring in the United States and occurring simultaneously to some extent in Western Europe, we can see that there is a sort of growing shared, not only cultural base as the previous discussants described, but also that it's having real life manifestations in the targets and strategies of far-right terrorists, unfortunately, today. So that's all I have. I'm really excited to talk about some of the connections here in these discussions. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Liz. So we've got a good 20 minutes for a Q&A. So I hope for a robust Q&A during that time. For our attendees, as a reminder, you're welcome to drop any questions you have in the Q&A section, and I will do my best we will do our best to get to as many questions as we possibly can. For the first question we have, Dorothy, it looks like this one might be for you, but how does an embrace of medieval iconography or historical messaging overlap with militia groups? For example, those with who have far-right views but don't explicitly endorse white supremacy, but still have some overlap.
So militia groups actually go there as well. And in fact, I can drop a link, and I don't know if you want to share it. I actually wrote something for my institution in relationship to the elections. I actually talk about the Proud Boys and the violent arm of the Proud Boys and the fact that they call themselves knights. And I'm actually interested in seeing the question that my institution asked me was to write a very short public piece to think about the election in relationship to the medieval past. And so I did like a 3-part kind of analysis, and I'm just putting that in the link. So there are the Proud Boys that are already organized as a kind of Knights of the Proud Boys unit, right? There are also, I would say, if you think of a longer trajectory or history of the United States, obviously the KKK has had a long Knights of the Ku Klux Klan thing happening. So it often just depends, but they sort of hook onto it. My other 2 examples in that little piece was actually Kelly Loeffler's commercial in relationship to her fight for the Senate seat, in which she calls herself more conservative than Attila the Hun, right? And then actually this piece that was written that actually tries to kind of co-opt the language of chivalry and crusade, but for what I would think of as like the Democrats, the sort of moderate Democrats. So there's a kind of interesting way in which people do realize that this language has some sort of emotional impact, right? And they're willing to go there and kind of use that whenever possible for whatever they do. So yeah, it does pop up in the militias. And so it will just depend, but there is, especially for the Proud Boys, a history of that.
Great. Liz, Donna, would you like to talk more about that, or we can move on to the next question?
Well, I definitely want to hear what Donna has to say about it, because I know that she was talking about Sparta and militias. So I'll just say really quickly, though, that one thing I've been thinking about is that, again, I've been thinking a lot about this larger transformation of the landscape of far-right terrorism in the US. And the sort of leaning towards Europe, especially among white supremacists, which has always existed, by the way, I should say. Obviously the connections with neo-Nazis, that's a reference, obviously, to the who Nazis were, right? So this, obviously, there's always been these transnational connections, but specifically the sort of fascist rhetoric and, sort of anti-democratic in that maybe we didn't see as much earlier. But of course, the militias are really focused on, the rhetoric tends to be more, sort of national focused and democratic focused. So I guess I hadn't thought too deeply about those kinds of connections in militias. And so that's why I'm actually particularly interested to hear from Donna and Dorothy about it.
Just to add one more thing, this is a little bit more anecdotal from colleagues, but if that sort of helps, and maybe wraps up in relationship to the discussion of white heritage politics, which is something, the term was coined by Daniel Christmas, who teaches at UNC Chapel Hill, in relationship to thinking about Confederate statues and the Confederate past. But there are a number of Vinland statues of like Leif Erikson floating weirdly in the United States, often in like Minnesota, but actually also Philadelphia. And there's actually one in Boston. So really kind of erected in the 19th or early parts of the 20th century that really wanted to like latch on to the idea that the United States, that actually the white US had like a heritage line to the Scandinavian Vikings and vis-a-vis Finland. And, the idea was the thought that the Northeast was where that might have happened, right? But a recent conversation with a colleague in Philadelphia about the I think it's the Leif Erikson statue in Philadelphia, that in fact the Proud Boys and several of the other groups use it as a kind of like rallying meeting place for so that it is not just maybe that they call themselves that, but they will go to these like sites as a way to kind of, do a meetup on specific days to like celebrate their white heritage and things like that.
Donna, do you have anything to add in particular for that?
I mean, yeah, I could absolutely talk a little bit more about that, although not with connection to, the medieval past, which it sounds like is what the question was about. But with relation to Sparta, I think that there's sort of a few connecting ideas there that I want to make sure to sort of keep the threads apart a little bit. So there's sort of Spartan role play, I would say, which sort of falls more into what Dorothy was talking about in terms of like shitposting, or sort of using antiquity as a kind of meme, when this easily replicable visual shorthand that automatically signifies political affiliation. So the image that I showed was when I was talking about that. Hold on, I can bring it back just for a moment. This guy. So in the bottom corner there, these are not people who belong to a militia, right? These are just sort of members of the far right. And then the gentleman with the Spartan helmet there was a guy who used the handle Beast Spartan, who then later disavowed the far right, sort of very publicly. So that's the first sort of I just wanted to separate out those two pieces because I think that that's kind of important. But as far as militias go, Sparta is really important to them for a few reasons. So obviously, most importantly, the sort of famed Spartan military discipline and rigor. And then also Sparta had this policy of xenolasia, the expulsion of foreigners. So a really rigidly enforced ethic purity as well, that is very salient here. And so the Oath Keepers, one of the militias, takes this sort of molon labe pledge. Molon labe is a phrase that comes from Plutarch from the Battle of Thermopylae, where the Persians told the Spartans to lay down their weapons, and King Leonidas said, "Come and get them." Molon labe. And this phrase has been picked up a lot by guns rights activists, of course, but also by far right militias, and so that's sort of how that web of loose, Spartan references works. It's not a very deep engagement with Spartan history, of course, and also it extends outside of these militias. Right before Thanksgiving, Ted Cruz tweeted an image of a turkey that said, "Come and get it." Just sort of like a pretty clear reference to the molon labe. And my colleague Sarah Bond has worked on the use of that phrase a lot more.
Sure. I think my favorite part of that story as well is that when Leonidas said, "Come and get them," the Persians did indeed come and get them. So.
Oh, my favorite, sorry, I'm just going to bring it back up again for 1 second. My favorite is that it's spelled wrong. So if you look at this, it's the flag, you can sort of almost see, it actually says Molop Lobs. Like the N is a pi, and the labe, the epsilon, is actually a sigma. So they got the Greek just like pretty wildly wrong. But I mean, that's, although, dunking on white supremacists for not knowing Greek letters is kind of fun and not entirely beyond the point, right? Like, because I think it is important to sort of pay attention to the depth and authenticity of the engagement, which I think again was something that Dorothy did a really good job of pointing to. But it can never be the end of that analysis, which I think some of my colleagues have sort of gone down more the route of, these are all the things that white supremacists get wrong about antiquity, which is, I think, not that useful of an avenue of exploration.
Great, thank you so much. For our next question, I'm going to bounce this to Liz. So this is a question specifically about whatever data we have. If you're unsure of the answer to this question, that's fine, because I'm not sure if we have this data, but just in case. How has the proportion of planned to spontaneous far-right attacks changed over the past 2 decades, both in the United States and Europe?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have good data on that, basically because no one has very good data on hate crimes. Like for those of you who are unaware of this, there's a whole debate about it. And I mean, frankly, hate crimes are reported to individual jurisdictions across the country, of which there are many, right? I mean, there are 3,000 counties. I don't know how many police jurisdictions and that kind of thing. So all the definitions are different. They, certain kinds of experiences might be interpreted differently. Hate crime statutes at the local and state level are different frequently than those at the federal level. And so the FBI collects this data, but jurisdictions are not required to report it. So many of them don't. And so it's just not very consistent. So we just don't have good data on it. Plus, we know from victim surveys and from advocates and lots of other places that a lot of hate crimes, many of which are spontaneous, go unreported. So basically, our data on the actual number of events on these kinds of lower level, less sophisticated crimes is just not very good. So, our work, our bias database focuses on the offenders. So we can say, what do we know about the people who commit them? And we end up looking at individuals for whom we have enough information, but that's only a small fraction of perpetrators. So yeah, I mean, I really can't speak to that. I can say that, as you see the numbers go up in the global terrorism database in Europe and in the United States, there is a requirement for premeditation there. And so planned attacks are going up. But I don't know that we know about spontaneous attacks. There's also all sorts of nonviolent activity that a lot of different kinds of advocates and researchers have pointed has grown enormously. So there's a question of, okay, are people sort of electing to participate in nonviolent legal activities as opposed to violent activities? There's a lot of different sort of avenues for expression of this kind of really extremist ideas. So that was a long way of saying no, I don't know. but it's important to sort of know why we don't know, I think. Yeah, thanks. Good question.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I think this is a question for all of our panelists. Are there any strategies for cultures to reclaim their cultural symbols from the far right, from European symbols to Hawaiian shirts worn by the Boogaloo Boys? And if anyone would like to answer, you're welcome to raise your hand so I can call on you. Dorothy, go ahead.
So I think the thing is that there has been an ongoing discussion, especially with digital scholars and journalists, like what to do. How do you like stop some of this proliferation and kind of virality and kind of it taking up so much space and room, right? One is you deplatform them, right? But often that is very hard because once you kick them off of one platform, if you can get them kicked off of a platform, then they move to another platform and it kind of, jumps all over the place. The other is to actually to make sure that there's like a counter narrative there, right? Part of the interesting part of reading the almost 800-page report, it confirmed a lot of what digital scholars have been pointing out, that YouTube is a hot cesspit mess of radicalization because there's actually no counter narrative or no moderation, no substantial moderation of things, because the Silicon Valley creators of certain platforms are in this kind of philosophy, like libertarian, extreme, freedom philosophy that has made them very, very wary of actually doing substantial moderation and substantial sort of, work with that. And so, what you have on YouTube, for instance, is like, for example, if you take the Vikings, everything that you can see on the Vikings or medieval Scandinavia on YouTube pretty much is going to either be white supremacist, far right material, down to modules on Prager University that look very, very professional and look like a real university, but it's not. To even if it's not that, often linked, like the next thing you will see is like a far right like radicalization video or a site. So there is no counter narrative. There's no sort of like counter radicalization programming to push back on that. That is anti-racist. That says things like, by the way, Viking is not real. It's actually a profession. It's basically saying pirates, and pirates are multiracial. So why are we even obsessing over this group and things like that? So the other kind of strategy is to actually do the counter narrative. So you don't go down those deep holes. So, you know, Sophia Noble has talked about this in her Algorithms of Oppression in relationship to Dylan Roofs and the kind of like Google cascade, looking up Martin Luther King, right? That like sort of pops up then all these white supremacist sites. So it's that issue. It's the sort of information counter narrative that needs to happen. And I think that actually is the thing that dislodges the kind of ways in which these spaces get attacked or like get sort of eventually identified with one group. I think this is why in Scandinavia, you have literally, what is it? You literally have groups that say we're Vikings against fascists, and they'll like, you know, label themselves with like posters and stuff and make it really clear, right? Because this is the only other way, because otherwise it's, all of it is really suspect. And I think one of the interesting things is, you know, in kind of a mainstream media way, what happened with the movie Ragnarok, right? Like, how did a director somehow defang that kind of Valhalla pantheon? Only because I think he could do it because he made it a kind of indigenous film, right? And he was able to do it by doing this kind of counter narrative of the whole thing. But otherwise, it you know, it could have potentially run into these huge problems, right? And instead, what he did was Taika Waititi was like, he blew up Thor's hammer, right, to the screams of white supremacists online everywhere. So I would say that would be the things I would suggest.
Sure. Donna, Liz, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, I think that some, you know, certain things I think that you do have to admit are sort of fundamentally white supremacist in a way that they cannot be reclaimed, right? That is sort of part. I think that's sort of like Anglo-Saxon, you know, is a tough term to. I mean, like maybe it could be redeemed, but also why, right? Or like the swastika, right? You know, so I think that you do need to understand there's sort of like a spectrum of reclaimability, where sort of like, you know, the medieval period as a whole, or you know, classical antiquity as a whole is something that, you know, that obviously, you know, we're not going to say like, okay, well that belongs to the white supremacists now, right? And that is sort of a narrative that, you know, that white supremacists will use in order to sort of hurt and discredit progressive scholars. Say that, you know, we want to just like cancel all of classics because of all the misogyny and the racism, which is so deeply misguided. But I think that's so I think that understanding where where something lies along that spectrum is really important before you put in the energy to do that sort of reclamation project, right? And to create the counter narrative. Because I mean, I think that Dr. Kim is absolutely correct that is sort of what you need to do. You need to provide alternatives, and the alternatives should be sort of, if you can, you know, better in terms of deeper, more nuanced, you know, more grounded in actual understanding of what was happening in the historical period that you're trying to draw connection with, but also in a way that, you know, doesn't try to diminish or take away the flaws in the period that you were talking about.
Thank you. Liz, do you have, oh, Dorothy, you got something to add? Go ahead.
Just to add to that, I think maybe we didn't really talk about it here, but it is talked about in the report, and something to think about is that the gateway to the medieval past is through video games, right? Because the number one way that people actually encounter a computer is actually through video games. So there's this very nodal cluster going on. So every medieval video game available to the billions of players is a kind of white supremacist fantasy. So there is no anti-racist counter narrative like video game of most of these historical periods we're talking about. It's very difficult to find one. And I think the fact that the New Zealand terrorists, he actually did spend time on video game sites and commentary threads and sort of these spaces that are sort of looped in with Gamergate that, you know, you will see if you are ever interested in trying to figure out what the kind of rhetoric is for some of these white supremacists as they're becoming radicalized. Those are the spaces you have to sort of start to really go to work through, and the kind of outsized impact they have is incredibly large.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add to that, or? I'm happy to open the floor up to anybody.
Yeah,
Yeah,
just super quickly to add and to sort of maybe bring this circle back. A word that, you know, we use sometimes to sort of describe that phenomenon, and you know, I do think just sort of having language and terminology is important. Even though this particular word is kind of disgusting, is the PewDie pipeline, which is sort of the it is the YouTube algorithm by which, so PewDiePie is a YouTuber, you know, for a long time the most popular YouTuber, who focused on games, but then, you know, went extremely far right at a certain point in time. There had always been sort of hints of that, but it became much more overt. And the PewDie pipeline is the process by which, you know, kids who are looking for video game content on YouTube, through the suggestion algorithm that, like, we suggest that you watch this next, you know, within a matter of a few hours, we'll be watching far right content.
Sure. And with that, I'm afraid I do have to bring our event to an end. We're a couple minutes over time, but we'll try to wrap it up pretty quickly. First, for our panelists, thank you so much for joining us today. I think this is a fantastic discussion. Yes, applause all around. Thank you. To our attendees, thank you for joining us today. As I mentioned before, our recording of this event will be available on our website by the end of the day. And while you're on our website, you're welcome to sign up for one of our other upcoming events. If you would like to reach out to any of our panelists with any questions you might have had, please send an email to us at start-events@umd.edu, and we'll be sure to pass along your questions to our panelists. Otherwise, everyone have a great day, and thank you so much for joining us today.